Rabbi Bookbinder. I'm going to hand the baton off to Rabbi Bookbinder, and he will go through all the appropriate thank yous, and he will introduce our sommeliers. But I get the honor, pleasure, and privilege of saying hello to you and introducing Rabbi Becher. So, number one is it's so great to see everyone, so many, first of all, faces and not just blank screens. But what an opportunity that we all have to come together, have fun, and learn about something. And I think closer to Hashem, get closer to the one above by appreciating all the beautiful things he gave us, especially something that the world and we all appreciate. It's something so amazing, which is wine. I just want to say that, that we all struggle with being happy. And I remember Rabbi Schiller says that we don't drink wine to escape our reality. We enjoy wine to enhance our reality. And I think that there's so much chaos in the world, but if we take stock of the fact that, at least for the next couple of months, we live in a free country. Okay, I'm not getting into politics, but that there's a lot of struggles that we all have of just being happy, appreciating what we have, being besimcha. And I think that is the greatest challenge of our generation, being happy. And when you're happy, you're productive. So it is a great honor to have Rabbi Becher. Now, Rabbi Becher is probably thinking that we only have his number on our guest lecturer speed dial because we always go to Rabbi Becher to speak to us. But the truth is that he's right. He is the only lecturer on our speed dial because even though there's so many rabbis out there, there's just something about Rabbi Becher's almost like, ability to make things fun, entertaining. He's the king of, I say, edutainment. Edutainment is where the modern speaker has to perform. It has to be entertaining, but you have to leave with some education. Rabbi Becher has this amazing ability to inspire, to make us smile. And what an opportunity we have to hear Rabbi Becher over the next couple of weeks in this evening speak about wine. Without further ado, someone that has taught, probably adding up thousands of hours of Torah at the Forest Hill Jewish Center via Zoom and live. It's a great honor to call upon Rabbi Mordechai Becher. Thank you so much for joining us, Rav.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to join you on this. Wine is an amazing subject. I just was in Egypt last week, a scholar in residence for a tour group in Egypt. And so I was reading that there is evidence of wine in Egypt dating back to about 3,150 BCE. 3,000, that's, we're talking about 5,000 years ago, about the time where when the pyramids, some of the pyramids, Dzoser's pyramid was built. And what's interesting is a Professor Patrick McGovern, who is the head of the Biochemical Research and Archaeological Research Unit, University of Pennsylvania, has determined that the residue that they were able to find of that wine from Egypt 3,000 years ago, the grapes were from the Jordan Valley. In other words, from the land of Israel. So we have wine export from Israel, 3,150 BCE. And of course, Israel, the Mediterranean area, is ideally suited for production of wine. And it played an important role in Jewish history. We're going to talk about that over the next couple of classes. An important role in Judaism, in our history, in our religion, economics, sociology, etc. And very fascinating. Wine shows up in the Torah, in the Bible, many, many times. Now, the first time it shows up anonymously, because according to Rav Meir, a student of Rabbi Akiva, Rav Meir suggests that maybe the fruit that Adam and Eve ate was actually the fruit of the vine. It may have been wine, according to Rav Meir. That's the first place that it crops up. The second place, not so great, is Noah. Noah gets off the ark, plants a vineyard, makes wine, gets drunk, no good things ensue. But later on, throughout biblical history, wine generally is looked at in a very positive way. When Abraham comes after winning a war, he comes to a city called Shalem. Shalem is the ancient name of Jerusalem, Yerushalayim. He comes to the city. He is greeted by Melchizedek, who is a monotheistic priest. And Melchizedek greets him with bread and wine. What better way to greet someone? Bread and wine. So this is at the time of Abraham. We know that when Isaac called his son Yaakov, Jacob, to give him a blessing, and he asked Jacob to bring him game, venison or something like that. Jacob indeed did that, but he also brought him wine together with that. You can't really have venison without having wine with it. That seems to be clear. And the symbol in the Torah, in the Bible, in the prophets and the writings, the symbol of prosperity and blessing, and you've probably heard the expression, right? Each person sitting under his ish tachat gefano, the symbol of blessing in the land of Israel, the prophets, the prophet Micha, the prophet Jeremiah, Yechezkel, also in the book of Kings, the symbol used is ish tachat gefano, a person sitting under the vine with wine. That was the symbol of blessing, the symbol of prosperity. When the Torah tells the Jewish people of incredible prosperity, it says, "V'hisig lahem dayish et batsir." V'hisig lahem dayish et batsir means that you will be harvesting the new grapes while you are still engaged in pressing the old grapes. As you'll have so many grape harvests that while you are pressing the grapes that you've harvested, you'll have to go out to the field, take some time to harvest the new grapes coming off the vines, a symbol of incredible, incredible blessing. We know that, and we will obviously elaborate on the many ideas about this in Jewish tradition, both mystical and otherwise, but it was used in the temple in Jerusalem. There was wine libation, that wine would be poured on the altar in certain ceremonies, certain sacrifices. Later on in history, wine came to be used for virtually any significant Jewish occasion. Let's think about this. A Jewish boy, the first thing he tastes after his mother's milk is wine. At a circumcision, at the bris milah, right, when they're saying the blessings and they're giving the kid his name, the moel will dip a little cloth in wine and put it in the kid's mouth. So first thing he tastes. We have wine every Sabbath, every Shabbat, Friday night, Shabbat morning, and so on and so forth. We have wine when we end the Shabbat, Havdalah, ceremony at the ending of Shabbat. We have wine every one of our festivals, every Yom Tov, except Yom Kippur. We have, in addition, Seder. The Pesach Seder is arranged around four cups of wine that we have in the course of the Seder. Every occasion, a Brit Milah we drink wine. At a redemption of the firstborn, we drink wine. At a wedding, the chassan and kala, the bride and the groom, drink wine under the chuppah, traditionally white wine, in case it spills. Right. Purely pragmatic reason. But in any case, the chassan and kala, the bride and groom, drink wine under the chuppah. There's 7 days of feasting afterwards, known as the Sheva Brachas, the 7 blessings. At each one of those meals, we say the blessings over a cup of wine, and then we share the wine between the chassan and the kala, and other people drink that wine. In the days of the Talmud, by the way, there were special blessings that were even said in the house of a mourner, in a shiva house, and those blessings were said also over the cup of wine. We no longer have that practice, but in Talmudic times, mourners also used to have wine. So wine is a very major feature of Jewish life. It was a feature of biblical life. It was later on, we know that in the Rhineland, in France and in Germany, Jews would produce wine. Jews in Muslim lands, because Muslims generally then and even now do not drink wine. It's considered to be haram, prohibited. Jews would produce wine in these Muslim countries, whether it was Morocco and Tunisia and Egypt and other Lebanon, many places where Jews lived in these Muslim, and Spain, of course, which was under Muslim control from 711 till around the 14th, 15th century. So Jews were producing wine then. And by the way, some of our great poets like Yehuda Halevi and the Ibn Ezra and Shlomo Ibn Gvirol wrote poems about wine and about wine tasting in Spain. So there's in addition to which, in Christian countries like the Rhineland and France, where Jews lived, Jews were involved heavily in the wine trade, not only as merchants, but also as growers and producers. And there was, of course, restrictions against Jews due to anti-Semitism in many places, but this was a profession that Jews were involved in. We'll talk, hopefully, in more detail about some of the economic impact of that on the Jewish communities, sociological impact on Jewish communities, but that was part and parcel of Judaism. The Talmud talks about exporting wine to Rome. It talks about wine from Cyprus that was white wine, strong white wine from Cyprus that was imported to Israel. And many methods of, there was even this strange method, they would soak pottery in wine, and then you'd be able, then the pottery could be actually transported without fear of spillage because it's absorbed, the wine's absorbed in, and then they'd put the pottery in water and they'd type of reconstitute the wine. I have no idea how this tastes. I don't know. To me, it does not sound awesome, but you never know. So these were features of wine in Jewish life throughout history. We know in the day of the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, when the Jews were confronted with Hellenism, when the Greeks, the Greek emperor, well, after Alexander died and the empire divides up to Syria, Seleucids, and the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, etc., there was a massive plague of assimilation. Jews were dropping out of Judaism right and left, what we call mityavnim Hellenists, and the Maccabeans, who we know, of course, as great warriors, as fighters, and etc. But amongst them were also some great rabbis and scholars. They made a very famous decree then about kosher wine. I mean, ostensively, all wine based on its ingredients should be kosher. It's grapes and yeast. That's it. Sometimes some sugar is added, but basically that's it. So the ingredients were not the issue. The issue was they felt that wine, because of the nature of wine, it lowers inhibitions. It creates a sense of intimacy, a sense of warmth. And the Maccabeans were very concerned that that this sense of intimacy and warmth would lead to intermarriage, and hence they made a decree about wine must be produced by Jews. Very, very fascinating decree, and we'll hopefully talk about that more also in the subsequent classes. With the return of the Jewish people to our homeland, to the land of Israel, there was a revival of an ancient winemaking industry. The Rothschild family, Baron Edmund de Rothschild, established the Carmel Winery in Rishon LeZion in 1862, and Baron Rothschild was involved in what they call the Chovevei Tzion movement. Chovevei Tzion means the lovers of Zion, a movement of religious Jews who were very heavily into the idea of settlement in the land of Israel. Of course, most of the early Zionists were secular, but there were many religious Jews involved in this, and there was people saw it as almost messianic, that there was a revival of this grapes, of the industry of wine in the land of Israel. In the 1950s and 60s, Israeli archaeologists found evidence of winemaking whereabouts in the town of Givon. There's actually a brand of wine called Givon wines, but they found evidence of Givon wines way back in the time of the Babylonian period, which is approximately 2,600 years ago, 2,700 years ago. So we see all throughout our history, right, wine playing a role in the Jewish people and in our religion and so on and so forth. It's absolutely incredible. So apropos of Baron Rothschild, the Carmel winery produced its first batch of wine produced in Israel with adherence to all the biblical agricultural laws of the land of Israel. There are quite a few of them. And they adhered to those laws and they produced wine. And they sent it to various they sent a bottle of it to various Jewish dignitaries around the world. One of the people who received the bottle of wine from Israel was Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, known as the Netziv. He was the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva. The Volozhin Yeshiva was the world's most famous Talmudic Academy yeshiva. It was at the time in Lithuania. Now I believe it's in Belarus. I haven't looked at the news. Could be it's in Russia now. I don't know. But in any case, the Volozhin Yeshiva was a very famous yeshiva, and the head of this yeshiva, the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, was very involved also in the Chovevei Tzion, Chibat Tzion movement, the lovers of Zion, in the religious Zionist movement. And he had a son. One of his sons was Chaim Berlin, who was a rabbi in Moscow. Another son was Meir Berlin, who moved to Israel and changed his name to Meir Bar Ilan. Berlin Bar Ilan. And there's a university in Israel named after him called Bar Ilan University. Some of you may have heard of it. So the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, was the recipient of one of these bottles of wine. The Rothschild from the Carmel winery, 1862, they send a bottle of the first wine that they've produced. In thousands of years, Jews were exiled from Israel, 70 CE, the Bar Kokhba revolt, 156 CE. Jews had not been living, not en masse at least, there were Jews there, but we didn't have a industry, agriculture in Israel for thousands of years. And now we're back home, and absolutely amazingly, they send him a bottle of wine. His son tells him that there's a bottle of wine that was sent from Israel to this little town of Volozhin in Lithuania. And he said, wait. He goes into his room and he puts on his Shabbat clothing, his long silk coat and his fur shtreimel. And then at Netziv, he says, to greet a bottle of wine from the land of Israel, the first wine produced by Jews in Israel in 2,000 years, he put on his Shabbat clothing in the middle of the week. And they hand him the bottle of wine. He looks at the label. He looks at the Hebrew on the label. He looks at and we hopefully will discuss wine labels, one of our other classes. But he looks at the label. He sees on it that tithes have been taken from the holy fruit of the land of Israel in accordance with Jewish law. The wine has been produced in Rishon LeZion. The very name Rishon LeZion, how symbolic. It means the first in Zion. And indeed, this was the first winery in Zion, and this was the first time Jews were making wine in Israel. And when the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, wearing his Shabbat clothing, when he held the bottle of wine, he started crying. He absolutely lost control. He was crying tears of joy, tears of emotion, and just to think about the fact that how this wine got to him was absolutely incredible. It's something that we often take for granted, but it's absolutely amazing. And we have throughout our history some Jews who were famous, sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly, for wine. We know that Rashi, Reb Shlomo Yitzchaki, who lived in Troyes, 1040 to 1105 in the Champagne region of France. Now, Troyes itself doesn't have great soil, apparently, for vineyards, but it was not uncommon for Jews who lived in that region that during the wine season, people would make their own wine. They'd probably travel to vineyards and harvest it themselves and press the wine themselves and make press the grapes themselves and make their own wine. And when you look at Rashi's commentary on the Talmud, it displays an intimate and expert knowledge of the process of winemaking, from the growing of the grapes, the cultivating of the grapes, all the way through to the fermenting of the wine and the creation of the final product. So Rashi was very, very famous for that. Wine also crops up in a very significant way on Purim. As we know, Purim is coming up today, happened to be the Purim Katan of Narbonne in France, 1242. Narbonne, place in France. So according to the Code of Jewish law, if a Jewish community experiences a miracle or a salvation, they are obligated to make their own little minor Purim. And there's numerous ones like that. Purim of Frankfurt, Purim of Cairo, Purim of Fez, Morocco. And this is a Purim of Narbonne in France, where the Jews were saved from a pogrom. And one of the features of those celebrations is drinking wine. The original Purim, which is going to take place in about a little over 3 weeks from now, we know much of it revolved around wine. Herodotus, a Greek historian, and Strabo both tell us that the Persians, ancient Persians, when they made a decision and they were sober, they would review the decision and only come to the final conclusion when they drank enough to be drunk, and then they would make the final decision while they were drunk. If they were drunk when they made the decision, when they were sober, they would review it. But generally, decisions were always made, at least half the decision was made when you're drunk. This was sort of standard. They believed, probably, that when they were drunk and they lost their own minds, so the divine mind integrated into them and helped them with the decision. So drunk decisions in the Persian government, actually it's probably a good idea for most parliaments nowadays. I think can't do worse, frankly. And we have, if you look, in the scroll of Esther, drinking features prominently. Esther is always inviting Haman and Achashverosh for drinking parties, which makes a lot of sense. If you've read Herodotus and Strabo, you realize, yeah, that's when they're making the decisions. And actually, if you go British Museum in London and the National Museum in Tehran, both have drinking utensils, gold drinking utensils from that period of Purim. And they hold about they're made of gold. They're called rhytons, and they're elaborate, beautiful utensils. I will show you one next time we speak. And they hold about 1 liter of wine. And people were usually pressured into drinking the whole thing in one shot. I'm assuming that the rabbi is not going to do that this evening, possibly next week, but not this evening. But in any case, that was a fame, and because of the centrality of wine in the Purim story and in Persian culture, the Talmud tells us, the rabbis told us to drink an excess of wine on Purim. Very unusual, very unusual obligation, but it's supposed to, according to the Talmud, it sounds like you're actually supposed to get drunk, whether that's literally true or not, but you're supposed to drink in excess of what you normally drink, which, at least for me, would mean dead drunk. But anyway, again, that is a very prominent festival in which wine is featured. The very word wine, which has relationship to some of the Proto-European languages, etc. The most ancient languages, wines related to the word yain and yain, which in actual Hebrew, the word for wine is yayin, which means wine. And it's a fascinating word because, and we hopefully will discuss this as well, the Talmud points out that the word yayin has a numerical value of 70. Yud is 10 and Yud is 10, 20, and Nun is 50. So it makes 70. What's significant about 70? I mean, aside from the 70 names of God in the Torah, but there's something significant about 70 in that it is also the value of the word sod, a secret. The Talmud says when wine enters, mystical secrets come out. In fact, the the Talmud says that it's actually good to have a little wine before you actually really get into something. It gives a clarity of thought, perhaps, not a lot of wine, but some wine. We know also that King David used wine as a symbol of blessing, the cup of wine, in which he famously said in one of his most famous psalms, the Lord is my shepherd psalm, the Mizmor David, in which he says, Kosi revaya, my cup runneth over. So one idea so that was all introduction, a little bit of the history of wine, a little bit about wine in Judaism and in the Tanakh and in our history, etc. Let me tell you one idea from a Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch about wine. All wine, the vast majority of wines, unless some yeast gets into the grape and produces drunken bees in the vineyard, which actually can happen. The phenomenon has been reported, by the way, of yeast spores on the grape skins, and if the grape breaks open and the yeast gets in there, it can actually ferment inside the grape. And there have been phenomena of bees in vineyards flying around type of drunkenly. Interesting. The animals can sometimes get drunk from drinking fermented juices. But vast majority of wine starts off as grape juice. What's grape juice in Hebrew? You might know grape juice in Hebrew is tirosh. Tirosh is grape juice, which is an anagram of the month in which it was usually produced in Israel, which is Tishrei. So tirosh, grape juice. Grape juice, frankly, not very good. Right? It's a sweet drink, which is great for kids in juice boxes. It doesn't have the depth. It doesn't have the flavor. It does not have the alcohol. It does not have the bouquet. It lacks all of these things. It's grape juice. But in order to turn into wine, it has to go through a fermentation process, biochemical process of fermentation, during which you would not be drinking the wine. But the end product is a vastly superior product to grape juice. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch says this is symbolic of life. We all start off life as grape juice. Sweet, cute, not much depth. But you see, if the human being wants to become great, if a human wants to become mature, if a human wants to become really elevated, then we have to go through fermentation, meaning we have to go through struggle, process of change, a process of effort, sometimes painful, but it is the effort and the pain and the struggle, i.e. the fermentation, that produces the wonderful end product of a great human being. And therefore, wine for us symbolizes the end of the process of struggle, the end of the process of fermentation, the end of this process. And therefore, at every point when we mark some occasion, whether it's having a child, whether it is getting married, married should come first, but okay. Anyway, but having a child, getting married, whether it's the celebration of weddings, whether it's the Sabbath or a Yom Tov, all of these are celebrations of the end product of a long period of effort, of struggle, of pain. And hence, King David talks about wine, the cup runneth over, the symbol of blessing. The prophets that I mentioned earlier talk about each person under the vineyard drinking the wine. That is the ultimate symbol of blessing, because real blessing is not something that's gifted to you. A real blessing is not something that's given to you that's incidental to your essence. The only thing that really counts are those things which are intrinsic to your essence. And the things which are intrinsic to our essence are only those things for which we've struggled and fought and really made effort to get to, i.e. gone through fermentation, maturation, and finally getting to wine. And that's one of the reasons that wine for us is such a magical and beautiful product, because it symbolizes all that. There's a prophecy of the prophet Isaiah who talks about messianic times. He says a really interesting word. He says, phrase. He says, that will be a time where there'll be yayin hamashumar, which means old wine, be'anavav, in the grapes. Now, you can't have old wine in the grapes. What does that mean? What it means is that we look forward to a time where we won't have the struggle. We'll have been through all the struggle of exile, the struggle of the diaspora, the struggle of human efforts against and with nature and so on and so forth. And the end of all that struggle we'll squeeze the grapes, and will come out of it will be some excellent old wine. That will be the messianic time. In the meantime, we drink wine which has gone through fermentation and struggle, and we too can identify with what the wine has gone through, because we're all born as grape juice, but hopefully now we're really good wine of very different types. And that brings me to the time when you'll be soon making a blessing over some wine and saying L'chaim or Ganbei or Nazdrovia or whatever it is, and enjoying the wonderful, wonderful wine that has been selected here. And so I'm going to end here and give it over to the various rabbis, Rabbi Eli, Rabbi Mordechai, and your sommeliers, who are going to be guiding you through the wine tasting and wine appreciation. And I hope you enjoy. Thank you very much.
All right, Becher, thanks so much, L'chaim, and we look forward to hearing your Torah next time we pick this up. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night. I want to hand the baton over to Rabbi Mordechai to thank all the people involved in this program. So I'll hand the baton over to him, and then shortly we'll start the second half of this program. Rabbi Mordechai, thank you. Before you thank everyone, I want to thank you for helping. Yeah, Shukayach, thanks so much.
Pleasure, Shukayach, thanks so much. So first of all, I'm about to introduce our wine judges, our sommeliers. But before I do that, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the amazing committee that we have who put this program together. Of course, that's Shimona Petrov, that's Jeff Silver, that's Sarah Perlis, and it's, sorry, I said Shimona already, Sam Mark Shammer. So thank you, all four of you. You guys were incredible, came up with amazing ideas. They picked the wines, they picked the foods, helped out with the invitation, spread the word, recruited, helped pack and hand out, and just, ideas, everything from soup to nuts. So thank you all. It was really, really great. Now it's my distinct pleasure. Well, it'll shortly be my distinct pleasure to turn to some bottles of wine and some really good food. But before I do that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce our speakers who we have. We're lucky to have joining us today Dominic, Ierullo, and Bruno Menaguzzi. Sorry, Bruno, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. I'm very sensitive, when you have the last name like Bookbinder, trust me, you hear all kinds of things. So both Dominic and Bruno are members of the Wine Judges of Canada, and that organization was established in 1967 as a nonprofit organization. It's one of the longest running wine judging and assessment organizations in Canada and the States. Currently, there's 50 certified judges, including 11 trained at the master's level. All members are active in communities across Ontario, including Toronto, Ottawa, London, Kitchener, Prince Edward County, with certified judges also in British Columbia, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. Many of the judges and wine writers regularly attend the various wine tastings and competitions throughout Canada, and most of them consult with restaurants, restaurateurs, wine consumer groups such as ours, or clubs, as well as winemakers, wineries, and their staff. Dominic has been a wine judge for over 25 years. I don't want to think how many different wines you've tasted in those 25 years. I don't even know if you, let's just say a lot. And you are trained to the master's level. You have a passion for wine, which stems from your 35 years of winemaking experience as a non-commercial winemaker. And Bruno, in addition to being a wine judge for over 10 years, you're certified in wine and spirit education, trust educator, and you are an Italian wine scholar. Both of you, to our benefit, have been working together with Simcha Wines. Simcha Wines, of course, provided us with the wines, and also just a shout out to Manny Azule from Eli's Fine Foods for providing us with the appetizers. So both of you have been working with Simcha Wines for the last 15 years, assessing and presenting kosher wines. And you've tutored tasting events like this, as well as with restaurants. So gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to bring both of you to the front, and I'm going to mute myself, and we're going to allow you to step us through the wines and through the appetizers.
That's great. Well, my name comes up instead of my face because I have a couple of computer issues, but you could still hear me clearly, even if you don't see me well.
We see you great.
Ah, okay,
We
good.
actually see you.
Is there any echo?
Are you getting an echo?
No, not much.
Because we're
Okay.
both in the same
Yeah, we're
room.
good. We're good.
Okay, great. Well, Bruno and I had the opportunity to taste the 3 wines, and we made some notes. And then after we did that, we did the food pairing, and so I'll just I guess we'll start off with just discussing each wine. So for those of you that are not familiar with what order to drink them in, the Chardonnay, the white wine, should be the first one we discuss. The Rioja, it'll be the second, and the Petite Syrah from California will be the third wine. Okay, so we're going to start off with our tasting notes on the Chardonnay, and you know, you can follow along, and we'll be discussing some of the attributes, the nuances that we notice in the wine. You may or may not be able to pick them up initially, but swirling the wine in the glass like this, you know, and if you can't do it freehand, you could swirl it on the tabletop, and then putting your nose in the glass. So you don't fill the glass, you're putting in a sample, maybe about an ounce, ounce and a half. And then when you put your nose in there after swirling it, the aromatics will come up, and you'll be able to pick up different attributes of the wine itself. So what we found when we tasted this Chardonnay was that it had a big aromatic nose. Nose meaning the aromas in the nose. It had an intense aroma of toasted oak, which a byproduct of that is vanilla flavor, vanilla odors, and there's some citrus notes of lemon and lime. So you may have to swirl it a few times to pick that up, and if you do, then you can make your own assessment as to whether you appreciate it or don't appreciate the qualities that the wine is presenting to you, because you have a choice. If this wine doesn't appeal to you as much, you have a choice to choose other Chardonnays that have different characteristics, because there are many different styles of Chardonnay. Before we get into the taste, Bruno, did you want to add any comments to that?
That's a good point in terms of styles. Actually, just earlier, both Dominic and I were talking about 2 big styles in the world that you'll often find. One being the oaked style, influenced by barrel, and the other one unoaked. And typically, many of you are familiar with the Chablis style, and that's what we would call the unoaked. And so the one we have in front of us, at least in our perceptions of the nose before we get to the palate, is that there's a lot of oak influence, a lot of wood influence. And some of the notes that Dominic talked about in terms of vanilla, the toasted oak, are very dominant for us as a primary aromatic. That's pretty much what I just wanted to add. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, now it's a little difficult to do, I guess, on a Zoom style meeting, but I always like my presentations to be interactive, so that if somebody had a question specifically about what we just said, you can come forward and ask, because later I find out if you wait till the end of the meeting that you usually forget that you were going to ask that question. But anyway, on the palate, when you taste it now, so after the swirling part and the nose, now you're going to taste it, and you just want to swirl it around in your mouth and then swallow it, and then that's when you assess the wine. After
let me just make a blessing as we are about to taste. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. Mm.
Cheers. So that's when you want to assess the flavor. So when I did that, I found that the Chardonnay on the palate had a very soft and smooth approach. So it was very, very soft. Now some Chardonnays or some wines may have a higher acid content, depending on where the grapes were grown, and it may be a little bit crisper, whereas this is a lot on the softer side. The acid is in balance, so there is acid there, and it's in balance with the body of the wine. Now, another way to assess a wine's quality is the length. Okay, obviously, when you smell the wine, the aroma should be appealing. When you taste the wine initially, it should be pleasant up front. It should actually, want to encourage you to have another drink. But one of the areas that is actually quite important with assessing the quality of the wine is the length. So after you swallowed the wine, and you could do this exercise, you'll find that you could still, the taste of that wine will linger in your palate. And the longer it lasts, it's usually a sign of a better quality made wine. Wines that have a short finish, that you taste it right up front and then it just kind of quickly disappears, that's a wine of lesser quality. So this wine has, in summary, this wine has a very attractive, big aromatic nose. There's a soft approach on the palate. It's well balanced with the acids, and it's got a very nice long finish, and it finishes clean. It's not gritty or bitter, or it's a nice clean finish.
Mhm.
So what we can do at this point is, if you want to ask a couple of questions specifically about it, we can ask the questions now, or we can save them all for the end. I'll let you decide.
If you have a question, just press the space bar and then it unmutes you so you can speak.
The space bar. Okay.
For the
Oh. For them to ask.
yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I was just checking the chat line to see if anyone had written something.
Okay. Okay.
So basically, that's what we're looking for. Just like we are in matching the food to wine, as Dominic had said, the key is all about the balance. In matching food and wine, we're looking for balance of both of them. We're looking for balance in the wine, and that's the balance between the acid and the fruit, between any tannin and the mouthfeel. We're looking at all the different components that you would have when you eat something. You have the 5 main flavors on your tongue. Well, we're looking at those five flavors complementing a wine when we do the food pairing.
Okay, did you want to do the food pairing right now, or do you want to do?
I'm open. We can certainly talk about the food pairing now and then get more in depth if we needed to later.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
they're going to have the
They're gonna be-
appetizers in front of them, so
They're probably a little
yeah,
hungry.
we're talking about this wine, so.
All right, Dominic. So interestingly enough, with the dishes that we were presented, Dominic and I, we went through all 3 wines, went through all 3 appetizers, and then we mixed and matched them and found, as you'll know in food and wine pairing, there's 2 main groups that you look at. And one is called the congruent wine pairing, which means that you're pretty much enhancing the same overlapping flavor profiles, versus complementary, which means they're almost contrasting. And so you would almost go to the opposite extreme to match a food with a wine. In these cases, we took out the Chardonnay, being the first one we tasted. And as Dominic had said, there's that vanilla. We've got some of that toasted oak, the citrus really enhanced, and the acid being very in balance, but it's present. So because of that, we looked at the foods, and you may question why we started with the mushroom risotto and then ended with the mushroom risotto, as well as with the quinoa black bean. And what I'd like you to do is because we've got two wines that we're going to have with the mushroom risotto that make a good pairing, but for different reasons. So let's start with the risotto, the wild mushroom risotto, and the Chardonnay. So if you can take a moment, put the mushroom risotto in your mouth, and at the same time, take the wine, the Chardonnay wine, at the same time. So very often what happens when people are looking to pair wine and food is they'll have the wine, I should say they'll have the food, chew the food, swallow the food, and then take the wine after. In a true wine food pairing, you want to do them at the same time. That's how you are trying to digest what the pairing is all about. So when you're in a restaurant and you actually want to do a wine food pairing, do them at the same time. Often we're in a social setting, we're in the restaurant, we're at friends' places, we're having the food, we swallow the food, and then we'll have the wine after it as a cleanser. But in this case, what we're trying to show you is to highlight how the wine is going to be pairing with the food. So if you've taken some of the risotto and now simultaneously had the Chardonnay, you probably would notice that we've got the high acid of the Chardonnay that is softening the wine with the mushroom. You'll notice that we've got the oak toasted notes that is earthy, just that we would get the earthiness from the mushrooms. Which brings me to the next pairing of this wild mushroom risotto, which would be with the Rioja. And Rioja being much more earthy with the, it'll have some tobacco scents that Dominic will talk about in a few minutes. And you'll find that when we go back to the mushroom risotto with the Rioja, you'll find another excellent congruent pairing where they will overlap their qualities.
Very good.
Good.
Okay, if you can
Yeah.
just touch me up a little bit with this.
Which one do you need now?
Yeah, both.
A little both.
Or three.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay, so has everyone had an opportunity to do that exercise that Bruno recommended? And if so, you know, you make a mental note of your results and how you may want to approach it in the future with other wines and foods that you enjoy.
And sorry, Dom,
Go ahead.
I was just going to add, there is no real hard and fast rule when we look at pairing food and wine. There are some guidelines that help us just to note that we're not going to have, say, a salmon with a Barolo, big, heavy, tannic red, because all that does is metallics, gives us a metallic taste to the salmon, for example. So those are some general big guidelines that we would follow. But it's not to say that we can't have a red wine when we have a fish. And it's all about some of the characteristics of that red wine. And we'll notice from when Dominic starts talking about the Rioja, how those tannins are not present anywhere near as one of the big tannic wines that we've may have come across elsewhere or at other times.
Okay, so the second wine that we tasted was a Tempranillo from Rioja. And in the Rioja district in Spain, the Tempranillo is the predominantly grown grape. It produces, generally speaking, a medium to full, but more on the medium side, bodied wine. So it's not that big, bold, punchy in the nose type red. It's more finesse. It's a more medium body. And so thus, because of that characteristic, it makes it actually much more versatile. So you can have it with light fare, like light food, or you can have it with grilled meats as well. And it just, depending on the style of the Tempranillo, or in this case, this one from Rioja, it'll be to your own taste. And the fun part of tasting wine is that in order to get better at it, you got to keep tasting. Anyway, this particular wine Up front in the nose, it was a light fruity nose. It has hints of tobacco, cherry, and cedar. And a lot of these characteristics that we pick up aromatics, they come actually naturally from the fruit during the vinification process. It has a good mouthfeel, meaning that when you take it up front, it's not astringent. It's just really nice the way it feels in the mouth. There's light tannins. Tannins are important to red wines more so. It helps with the aging process, but tannins are bitter, especially when a wine is young. This wine has light tannins and they're on the tongue. So there's two types of tannin. Just to talk about that for a second, the tannin that you get from the actual fruit, from the grape, will coat your gums and teeth. The tannin that you get from the aging in an oak barrel, wood tannins, will be on the top of your tongue. Okay, so this one, after you've tasted the Tempranillo, and using the same exercise, after you've tasted it, swirl it around in your mouth, you'll find that you're going to get a little bit of grittiness on the top of your tongue. That's wood tannin. And that's okay, because when you're drinking it on its own, it's going to be much more noticeable. But when you have it with food, like you're going to have it in this next pairing, you'll find that the tannin isn't as pronounced, and it's actually almost disappears. It has the light tannins on the tongue and in the finish as well, so it lingers into the finish. On this one, maybe because of the fact that it's more of a medium-bodied wine and it's 13.5% alcohol, the alcohol, is a little bit noticeable, but only in the finish. You get that little bit of heat, up in your upper chest. It's got good length. And the alcohol actually helps with the length, but the wine itself is really well made, and it's got good length. And the nice thing about this wine is very easy drinking. So you can have this with food, or you can have it just as a glass of wine, socially on your patio, if you feel like a red as opposed to a white, because it is that easy drinking.
Yeah. Good.
So, you want to do the food pairing?
Yeah, what I'd like to do is now go and circle back to the wild mushroom risotto. And so take some wild mushroom risotto in your mouth, and then simultaneously add the Rioja, add a sip of Rioja together. So now here's the big difference from the Chardonnay. The Chardonnay was high acid. We always want the acidity in the wine to be greater than the acidity in the food. In this case, the toasted oak of the Chardonnay went well with the mushroom risotto. But now this red has a hint of tannin, but they're light. They're very much like, generically, you might want to say Pinot Noirs that are light in tannin, which go well with fish. And also, in this case, the wild mushroom risotto, being earthy, has a perfect pairing with the Rioja. They're very different. So if someone likes white, someone likes red, you can take both of these out with the wild mushroom risotto, and both people would be perfectly happy. This comes down to a personal choice now. It's not necessarily one dominating another in terms of pairing, but what you personally prefer. And I would not be surprised if a show of hands that showed half and half. Some prefer the white to the risotto, and some would prefer the red to the risotto. Personally, I like both, and I would probably do a rosé and mix them together. No, I'm just kidding. But I do like the Chardonnay. I just find the Chardonnay is a very nice complement to this mushroom risotto. As it is, when we get to the next pairing, which is the quinoa black bean slider. So here, what we have is a case where there's some earthiness of the vegetables, and the vegetables themselves present some acidity to the overall food pairing. And like I said, one of the major tips that you want to take away from this session is that the acidity in the wine should be greater than the acidity in the food. And if you ever have some food that's you think is a little too low, a chef's secret often is to take some lime and just a couple of squirts of lime on the food, or lemon, especially lemon. It's interesting that if you ever are or have ever gone to Florence and asked for a Florentine steak, some restaurants will present it with a slice of lemon. And the lemon is to add that hint of acidity that will bring up the overall flavor profile. So when we're looking at the quinoa or the mushroom risotto, when we're looking at the high acid wine to pair with it, we're wanting to look at the buttery flavors from that oak aging that's softening the wine and supporting that creaminess in the risotto or the full vegetable melange of the quinoa black beans.
Bruno?
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I see that there's some questions that came up in the chat that you may not have noticed. So I just wanted to know if I could ask both you
Absolutely.
and Dominic some of the questions that came up
Sure.
on behalf of some of the people.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So one of the questions is, what distinguishes Chardonnay from other wines?
Well, definitely we're looking at the grape varietal. That is the number one characteristic is when you're looking at the varietal. So Chardonnay is very, very prolifically grown around the world. It is one of those canvases that winemakers absolutely love. It is probably their favorite canvas to begin with. As Dominic and I know, we've made wines for a long time. We've been judging wines in the Wine Judges of Canada, and the styles are the full spectrum of a rainbow. And anywhere from the unoaked to oaked. And the Chardonnay grape is very prolifically grown around the world because it is very easy growing in all types of climates and soils. So a Chardonnay from, say, Niagara, which we're familiar with, you will typically have, when you smell and taste it, you'll have these high acids from Niagara. But then you go to a hot climate, say Central California, and the acid will be low. Well, for a balanced wine, you need other components to balance the acidity. So if the wine is high in acid, then you need the body to be lower. That'll help balance the wine. So a Chardonnay can grow anywhere, hot, cold climate. Hot climate will give you low acid, and so you need more body to give it balance, and the opposite for a cold climate.
Yeah, now Chardonnay is very versatile in the styles that it could be made or produced in, ranging from oaked to non-oaked, and many different variations in between. Just to make sure we answered the question properly, if the question was what makes Chardonnay stand out compared to other white varieties, if that was the question, well, each variety has its own characteristics. Like a Sauvignon Blanc will have its own characteristics, but the characteristics also are affected by the terroir, where they were grown, how they were produced, whether it's a hot climate country, whether it's a cool climate country, will determine the attributes that you will get from a different white grape. Same holds for all of them. So the Viognier, the Sauvignon Blanc,
Gewürztraminer, Riesling.
Rieslings, they all have their own characteristics. And we always encourage individuals to become familiar with the different taste profiles by having a few friends over and getting, one Chardonnay, one Riesling, one Sauvignon Blanc, and then doing your own little taste comparison. Mm-hmm. And we find that it's educational, and more so it's fun to be with friends and enjoying the exploring of different flavor profiles.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question was, what are some white wines on the sweeter side? So in the kosher market, we're all familiar with the Moscatos that have kind of overtaken the sweet white wines for the past decade or so.
Mhm.
But, you know, other than that Barton or a Moscato.
I would say, you know, probably, and one of my most favorite whites in the world, Riesling. And as Dominic was saying, all these grapes are terroir driven, climate driven. The slope, the clone of the varietal. So with Rieslings, the two main styles are the very dry, which we typically would be synonymous with Alsace. So Alsatian Rieslings are typically drier than what you would find as Germanic Rieslings, which are typically more off dry. And they're absolutely wonderful. And the key again is the balance of the acid. Most of these wines are very high acid. We would say above medium. We would actually call them high. So with a high acid wine that's going to be sweet, they would typically have to be, and Riesling would be an example of that. One of the best examples.
So there's sweet Rieslings, you're saying, because the question was
absolutely.
Sweet wines.
Absolutely.
Yes, sweet wines are very common because the market that they appeal to would be a young wine drinker. Let's say someone who's hasn't really consumed a lot of wine, and some of the dry wines, especially reds, are a little bit more on the bitter side because of tannins. They're not as appealing to a wine drinker in his early or her early stages of consuming wine. So the sweeter wines are a little bit more appealing because they're easier to taste.
Yeah, and we do, or at least I'm differentiating between an off-dry sweet wine versus a dessert sweet wine. When we get to the dessert sweet wine, we're into different classifications of actually the types of grapes, because then you can get, you can get the Tokais from Hungary that are ferment grape based, or the Verduso di Ramandolo that are Picolite, for example, that make luscious sweet dessert wines. The Sauternes that we get from Sauvignon Semillon, mostly Semillon. These are just big, luscious dessert wines. So we're differentiating that sweet wine, dessert wine, versus the off-dry that we'll see later on with the Petit Syrah, which is off-dry, kind of sweet.
You have another question?
There's one other one, but I'd like to save it for later and let you guys continue.
Good. Okay.
Now, did we want to taste the Rioja with the
mushroom? Yeah, we did.
Okay, so we did already.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
With the mushrooms, yeah. So now we'll go on to the
Petit
Syrah.
Okay, so the third wine that we tasted today is a Petit Syrah from California. California being a hot climate growing area, which promotes higher sugars or sweetness in the actual grapes, the fruit. So thus, when vinified, it's the sugar that converts to alcohol. And sometimes if the sugars in the fruit are very high, the yeasts may not have the ability to ferment all of the sugar to alcohol. And we sometimes get remaining sweetness, which we call residual sweetness. There's nothing wrong with it. But if you were trying to achieve a dry wine as a winemaker, then you're disappointed. If you were trying to achieve a wine that was ultimately going to be off dry, then you're saying, hey, okay, I'm all right. I'm in the game here because this is the way it finished, off dry. So this wine, when we first put it to our nose, man, it was very jammy, raspberry, with chocolatey notes, hints of spice, and oak and vanilla in the background. So as far as the aromatics go, again, do that same exercise, swirl it in your glass, and when you put your nose in it, you should get some of the comments that I made. You should be able to detect them as well.
Oh, absolutely. the jam just comes right through, Dominic. I mean, if this was any thicker, I could spread it on toast. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, beautiful.
So when we taste it, now we're going to taste that upfront sweetness, that off dry flavor, that it lingers actually throughout the whole tasting profile, because it's there right up front. And as you continue to assess it, as you've swirled it in your mouth, you'll notice that the sweetness just continues to linger right through, right till the end. And then at the end, you just get a little bit of tannic finish, just a little bit of light bitterness that just kind of finishes the wine off. And it's again on the tongue, so we know that it came from the oak aging.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yes.
Delicious.
Yes, very delicious. And I would assume that someone who is not an avid wine drinker may find this a little bit more approachable because of the being off dry than something that's fully dry, like the Tempranillo. But the Tempranillo is medium bodied, so it would be easily to adhere to as well. But if you get a big Cab, Merlot, Syrah, those wines are really big, and they're big in tannins, and they're dry. There's no sweetness to cushion the flavor, and a young wine drinker would find them a little bit too bold for them. Whereas once it's sweetened a little bit, like this Petit Syrah, it's a lot more approachable and would probably be enjoyed more.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so now that you've had a chance to taste the Petit Syrah, why don't we match it with a food pairing? And at the end, our last appetizer is the stacked veggie with Romesco sauce. So those of you who are familiar with Romesco sauce, it's almost like a passata, an Italian red sauce, but has pepper sauce in it and some nuttiness. So pine nuts and peppers are added to the tomato sauce. So you can just imagine how acidic itself the sauce would be. Now add a stacked group of vegetables, and now you're looking for something to complement that food. And so remember, one of the first tips I gave at the beginning was that the acidity in wine should be greater than the acidity in food. Of these three wines, right, you've got the acid in the Chardonnay, you've got the acid in the Petit Syrah, but also what you have here, what you don't have in the others, is a bit of sweetness. So here's the thing. When we look at some of the tips we're looking at, the second tip I can give you is that salt is your friend and sugar is less so. So salt will help reduce the harshness in the food. It will reduce the bitterness and acidity. So take this stack of veggies, add some salt to it, and it will actually reduce the bitterness or the harshness in the wine. At the same time, if you add sugar to this food, it will actually increase the harshness, increase the bitterness or acidity, astringency. But since you've already got a high acid food, pairing it with a wine that has some sweetness to it, you will actually find that the wine needs, this particular wine being off dry, needs some acidic food for the balance. It will make the wine less sweet in your mouthfeel. So take a big piece of this stacked vegetables, put it in your mouth, and while you're beginning to chew it, take in the Petit Syrah. The combination of the two will help soften the sweetness of the wine. You'll actually perceptibly notice the sweetness is less intense than it was on its own. Now here's the difference. Now, clean, or just if you have some water, it'd be great to just rinse yourself with your mouth, to cleanse your mouth. And then try the same stack with the Chardonnay. Now the Chardonnay, it's got high acid as well, but it doesn't work just as well as the sweeter wine, but it does work well. And then lastly, take that same stack with the Romesco sauce in your mouth, and at the same time add the Rioja. And that does not work. Of the three, that one works the least best, even though you'll find some earthiness in the mushroom that's got the vegetable, but it's too dominated by the other vegetables and the Romesco sauce. The Romesco sauce just takes it one notch higher with the higher acid, and so you need that slight off dry wine just to help complement and soften the wine. There we go.
Do we have any questions?
That's amazing. Yeah. So first of all, thank you to Belinda Schneeweiss, who just gives a shout out that there's a winery, a kosher winery in Ontario called Sifona. So Belinda just gives a shout out that Sifona makes a fantastic local kosher Riesling. So if anybody's looking for one, I'm sure we can find it at the local LCBO, or you can even go down to the Sifona winery in Niagara-on-the-Lake. They have a beautiful location there. There is another question, and this is a much more global, like a larger picture global question. And the question is really, in all that you've described so far, what might, in big, broad brushstrokes, I guess, distinguish a white wine from a red?
Tannin is certainly one of the biggest items to think of, because tannins will come from the skin, and white wines are very, very low in tannin. Though if you ferment white skins for a long time, you will extract some tannin from the skin, even white wines. But tannin is certainly one of the biggest differentiators in terms of flavor characteristics. And when we're talking about flavor characteristics, when we're trying to match wine and food, so white versus red, the tannin is the big contributor in terms of thinking of the matching of the food to the wine. And so, we only can smell, I should say taste, 5 basic items or on the tongue, right? We've got the salt, sour, sweet, bitter, and savory. So we can smell thousands of components, but we can only really taste 5. And it's the intermingling of these 5 components that we try to match our food and pairing, our food and wine pairing. So when you're looking at reds, that has the tannin, and the tannin is a very big component of the bitterness on the tongue that Dominic was talking about earlier. So I would say if you're looking at white versus red in a blind tasting, you should perceivably be able to feel the gums with reds, because that's where the tannins will hit. Tannins will give you a drying sensation in your mouth versus an acid. Acid will make you salivate. So tannin will make your mouth pucker, and an acid will also make your mouth pucker, but it will salivate your glands. So you'll produce more what's the word? Spit?
Saliva.
Saliva.
Yeah, see, the red grapes are fermented on the skins, and that's where a lot of the character, flavors, aromatics come from, the skins.
Mm-hmm.
The whites are crushed. Maybe they may get a little bit of skin contact for, a few hours, or sometimes as much as a day, but never enough to extract the same type of characteristics that the red wines would extract from the skins, because they just haven't been on there long enough. With some reds, or most reds, when they're fermented pretty well out till they've converted all the sugar to alcohol, and even the alcohol again starts to extract color and flavor from the skins. So the whites are always going to be a little bit more light to medium body. Very seldom will you find a full-bodied white, It might be in the form of a Chardonnay, especially oak aged. But for the most part, most whites are light to medium, whereas most reds hinge on the medium to full side, with some on the lighter side, depending on the grape variety.
Amazing. Okay, so Chad Wolfond just read my mind. Chad, you're amazing. Like, talk about ESP. So he's asked a question that I wanted to ask. So here's the question. It used to be that people said, there's a general rule, red wine with red meat and white wine with fish and white meat. And so Chad asks, and I've heard more recently, drink whatever you like with whatever you want. So Chad asks, what are your thoughts on pairing white or red to different foods, various meats or fish?
Yes. Again, I would not take a big, full-bodied Barolo, for example, or Amarone, which are very heavy, full-bodied, full tannin, high alcohol, high acid wines, and pair them with a fish. Yes, generally, drink whatever you like if that's what you like to have with fish. But there are some general guidelines, and that one being the tannin in the wine, especially red wine, will make fish taste metallic. It will actually have this coating of, like you have a tin foil in your mouth when you have salmon. And I'd love for you to try that one day. Just have some salmon, have a big full-bodied red wine beside you, but just not until the end of the meal, because you certainly don't want to ruin your palate at the beginning. But try it. It'd be just wonderful. And if you don't understand the tannin itself, try this experiment. Next time you're at the grocery store, grab some grapes, take them home, wash them, and then take the grapes off the stem. Take the raw stem and chew it. And so just like I can see some of you just cringing right now, right? Chewing this raw tannin. So imagine that coating your mouth with some fish, because fish is usually delicate. And the reason we say white wine is because of that lack of tannin, but it's got the high acid to cut through any cream sauce that you have on the fish or how the fish is prepared. It's generally a delicate dish. And so when we're looking at food and wine pairings, we're looking to match the weight of the food with the weight of the wine. And generally, fish is considered lighter weight than these big, heavy reds. So yes, generally drink what you like, eat with what you like, but there are some guidelines, which I'll call guidelines, that I'd like to adhere to. And so I would not take a low intensity food, something very soft like boiled potatoes, and with a boiled potato have a big aromatic Riesling with it, because it's slightly sweet, and then you've got no flavor in the boiled potato. You've got full medium body in the Riesling. You've got no body in the potato. So there are some guidelines that I would still adhere to, but certainly beyond what we have time for. But it's a fascinating topic.
See, now, depending on how the food is prepared. So let's say you were making chicken cacciatore, okay, which is going to be like a chicken stew sort of, and it's going to be in a spicy red tomato sauce. Well, that would be a red wine with that would be appropriate. And it's not because a chicken or not chicken, it's because of the way the food is prepared. Because then that becomes a fuller meal. It's not like just having, let's say, a chicken breast or leg grilled on the barbecue. You could have a red wine, but then you would want to lean more towards what we tasted in the Rioja, something a little bit more medium bodied. Okay, so depending on the food, you look at it and say, well, this is a heavier meal, the way it's been prepared. So I could have a heavier wine. Exactly.
Take a chicken breast and then you up it with the cacciatore sauce. All of a sudden now you've got a heavier, a weightier food group. Yeah.
Okay. Amazing. All right. Guys, Dominic and Bruno, I want to thank you both so much. You've given us so much to think about, so much information. So thank you both so much. I just want to give a quick shout out also. Next Tuesday and the Tuesday after, Rabbi Becher will be back again next week. He's talking about Jews and wine, history, sociology, and economics. And then in 2 weeks today, Rabbi Becher will be talking about Judaism and wine, mitzvah, Kabbalah, and symbolism. Special thank you again to our amazing committee members, to Sam, to Shimona, to Sarah, to Jeffrey, and a special thank you to Nancy Klein, who helped quarterback a lot of this in the office. Also, special shout out to Simcha Wines and Eli's Fine Foods. And thanks to all of you who joined us. We hope to see you again next week. So thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Rabbi Eli, for always being that cheerleader that you are.